part two of our discussion about the Godzilla remakes versus the original. This time we will start off with the 2014, which was the first of the Legendary Monsterverse, and we'll also discuss the Japanese kind of counterpart, so to speak, Shin Godzilla. I'm John Chang of Dan Edmonds.
Hey there.
And actually,
I'm rocking my. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say you're broadcasting live on location there, and
I know, right? This is yes, very different. I'm actually in the US at the moment.
It's a East Coast, West Coast thing.
Yeah, East Coast, West Coast, anybody killer, as Dr. Dre once said. So yeah, and I'm rocking a nice kind of country style moustache this week and plaid shirt just to top it off.
I think for this week, one of the discussions that's kind of I thought about, like we kind of talked a little bit about the fascination with monsters and stuff, and for me, I thought maybe we could talk about our earliest memories of Godzilla. For me, it was like kind of these movies that they would have in the afternoon, and pretty much all week long at 4:30 they would run like one monster movie after the other, and of course they rotated through others movies and stuff like that. But Monster Week was one of the best times that they had, because they would do like Godzilla and the Godzilla versus Kong and throwing Gamera in there for the mix and stuff like that. So that's like kind of I think where I kind of really fell in love with the whole Godzilla world and stuff.
Yeah, it's funny. We didn't get a huge amount of exposure to Godzilla in the UK, aside from the cartoon where you had Godzilla and Godzuki. That was probably my earliest sort of memory of Godzilla. We probably, funnily enough, the 76 version was probably the one that I saw first.
Okay.
Oh, no, sorry. I'm talking about King Kong, aren't I here? No, sorry.
Okay.
Totally wrong. Yeah. Wrong franchise. Yeah, I must have seen them, but they were quite quirky, niche kind of movies. The kind of 60s rubber suit Japanese versions that we saw. Yeah, so not a huge amount of exposure to them, I would say, growing up.
But yeah, I think definitely like you said, the rubber suit kind of thing is probably what most of us are familiar with until more recently. I think it's been interesting to kind of see this, updated and so I guess let's dive into the 2014. I think one of the things that's interesting is here we have a couple actors who are quote unquote serious, Bryan Cranston and Juliet Binoche, who are kind of I think this probably was the time that you wouldn't have imagined these folks starring in a kind of a monster movie, stuff like that. And I think Legendary wanted to kind of signal that, like, hey, this is not your kind of dads or your kiddie kind of afternoon kind of monster movie and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's quite nice to see Bryan Cranston in it. He sort of acted his way through the scenery quite a lot in the first sort of half an hour, 40 minutes that he's in it.
Right.
Juliet Binoche was quite good. I mean, they're all very good, and but I mean, yeah, you're right. It was kind of weird to see them in a monster movie, but I mean, I did kind of like this idea that they created the conspiracy of the sort of hidden cabins where this creature had resided, and obviously that kind of builds on this later on in the franchise. But that was quite a compelling sort of start to the movie. I think it kind of fell off after that, really, for me, a little bit. In the it was, I mean, it has. I can't remember his name. I mean, there was a lot of action. It was pretty decent, but there wasn't really anything terribly interesting, I would say. After that, it just became a fairly run-of-the-mill action movie where it was just Godzilla chasing Muto around.
Right.
But I mean, but the effects were quite good. They obviously spent a lot of money on them. They looked pretty good, and there was a fair amount of action, but there wasn't a lot of really. They spent all this sort of energy developing this character of Bryan Cranston and the son and things, and they didn't really seem to like go anywhere after that. I mean, Elizabeth Olsen was kind of a bit lost in the mix. And
right.
so
This is interesting that this came after her what's called being in Old Boy, which is the other remake that we saw with her. And I mean,
right.
I think that's the thing that like part of like the challenge is like on one hand they want to have this human story right and stuff, so they try to do it with the father son thing, and then like the son kind of trying to I guess in some ways redeem like kind of not only like the legacy of the father and stuff, because like it became a thing where Bryan Cranston's character was like thought to be kind of basically imagining like that there was something going on and stuff, because it started out with this nuclear accident, and I think that's kind of like in some ways almost like a reference, and we'll see more of that in Shin Godzilla, to the problems that they've had with the like the Fukushima nuclear accident and stuff like that, that they almost like wanted to kind of make it that like there's something else kind of happening, right? Like you said, this kind of conspiracy and like this plot that the these monsters are just being suppressed, and kind of almost like an Area 51 kind of thing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I thought there was obviously some sort of, I don't know, fairly surface level referencing to atomic testing, and it wasn't blamed on the French in this one. It was actually sort of, well, actually no, I mean, they did sort of reference it was from nuclear testing in the Pacific, wasn't it, in the 2014 version, if I remember, and then this was exacerbated through the use of nuclear power, hence why the power station gets destroyed.
Yeah, whereas the French were blamed on the the 2014 one, this one we actually accepted some responsibility that we were the ones that the U.S. was like doing the testing and stuff.
Yeah. So at least there was that, but I mean, I think it almost has more in common with, say, the Fukushima disaster than the actual testing or the result of the wartime attacks. Because this one is more sort of, it seems like nature rebelling against humanity in the form of Godzilla, in that he's sort of feeding off the radioactivity, and it's the radioactivity that's given birth to Muto and its parasites that are sort of living off the radioactivity. So it has this sort of narrative of, basically technology versus nature is the main kind of theme, but it's only kind of, it's a cursory glance to it,
right?
Because most of it is more involved in creating a mythology for other future monsters to show up. But I mean, there's lots of action. It's pretty good. It's what I would call a good bank holiday movie. You could sit down, on a holiday, watch it, enjoy it, not put too much effort into thinking about it, and it's pretty good.
I think it's interesting that also Ken, another kind of more or less serious actor, Ken Watanabe, is also introduced. And so he's kind of like the thread that's kind of starting to tie this kind of monsterverse. And then Sally Hawkins is her or his sidekick. So it's interesting that here we have an Asian character who's Dr. Serizawa, who's not the sidekick. He's like kind of becoming this expert that kind of and I think that's maybe in some ways consistent with the Japanese versions of Godzilla, where have these scientists who are like kind of the ones with the answers and stuff, and like all the military and all the other people have to rely on them for helping them to kind of navigate, hey, how do we like destroy this thing and stuff. And then that's definitely the other key discussion, right, which is like initially the thought is to bomb Godzilla and stuff like that, but it quickly becomes something else, like you said, which leads to the whole battle of the kaiju.
Yeah, and I think that is quite interesting in these movies. where they portray different people, if it's politicians, military, or scientists. Nearly always the scientists are the heroes, more or less, of the story. Of course, that's kind of flipped a little bit in the 2014, because whereas in the original, the military were almost like the antagonists, making Godzilla worse, and it was only really the scientists who had the solution. In this, you've got the scientists who are obviously trying to find the solution as well, much like the 1999 version. But it's really, our rogue military guy, who I'm trying to remember his name. He's an English actor who was in Kick-Ass, but I can't remember his name now.
Aaron Taylor Johnson, yeah.
Taylor Johnson, yeah, Aaron Taylor Johnson. So he's kind of like the rogue military guy who's saving the day by blowing up the Muto's eggs and things like this. As always, spoilers galore in our videos. So they've kind of tried to try and do a bit of a flip of the usual kind of roles in terms of who's the goodie and the baddie, and who is the sort of intelligent and the less intelligent people in terms of trying to provide a solution to it. So yeah, aside from that though, I don't think it really breaks too many boundaries really in terms of what it's trying to do. I don't think it has much in the way of commentary on Japanese culture post-war or anything like that. Really, it doesn't really try and there's no sort of fleeting shots of children with radiation burns like the 1954 version, or I think the only other thing that's noteworthy is the fact that like Godzilla's appearance changes yet again, right? Like it's funny how we had, of course, the original, which is kind of the guy in the rubber suit, stuff like that. Then the 1999, they tried to make him more of this kind of giant chameleon or giant, what's it called, lizard, stuff like that is kind of, crawling a bit on the legs and stuff. And then now we're kind of have this like, almost like a combination again of like kind of the upright Godzilla and kind of one that kind of crawls a little bit more and stuff, and we see a lot more swimming. Like kind of, in fact, a good part of the movie is we see the little fins like kind of almost like jaws and stuff. There's a lot of swimming, a lot of tracking Godzilla around. That's what I felt. I felt like I watched a lot of following monsters around in this movie and not a lot of fighting. It seemed like all the fighting happened in the last 10 minutes, and there was most of them was just trying to follow the monsters around.
Right.
So there was quite a lot of that. I mean, and the other thing that was kind of different was, Godzilla is quite conscientious in this. He's given a sort of thinking presence, which he isn't so much in 1954 or in the 1999 version, really. He's just a kind of, he's basically in 1999, it's man versus nature. He's just an expression of nature that's, just is misunderstood and just needs to be able to survive and do whatever. In this, he's actually almost seems to be kind of like a conscious actor in it, in that he knows, oh, hang on a minute, I've been sitting underground here for a couple of 100,000 years. Seems like there's a radioactive monster. I better just pop up and take care of that and not step on too many people in the process. So, they really tried to actively make him a kind of a hero character in this.
And I think, part of the whole Legendary Monsterverse thing is that they kind of, almost like now have this kind of thing of that there's this ecosystem with the monsters, and he's like kind of this apex predator or something. That's their big thing, right? Where he's like king of the monsters. And in fact, that's of course the other name of the movie that we've had and stuff. And then like it's kind of like that they kind of really emphasize him being this kind of alpha dog, right, and stuff with the monsters and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that's kind of interesting in this is the way that there's almost this sort of self-congratulatory thing of the filmmakers, and the monsters are so beautiful that the scientists have to kind of sit back and admire them for 10 minutes and go, oh, this is fantastic. And it kind of it reminds me of the whole Susan Sontag article where it's like, you know, we revel in this sort of destruction of the world, and this really is a kind of very kind of pure but kind of somewhat superficial expression of that, in that, you know, we just want to watch this to see what the monsters look like and what they're going to destroy and how they work, basically.
Right.
There's not much else to it, but it's quite fun just seeing them, you know, destroy stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there is something kind of like it's almost like city destruction porn, you know, like kind of that we're, you know, like we whereas normally, right, we're you know, and even in the 54 one, there's a sense of like kind of, you know, like you see the trauma of the people and stuff like that, but we're kind of that much more removed from it now. Like we see a little bit of devastation, just kind of like, you know, where okay, you know, people are, you know, uprooted and all that kind of stuff, but really, like you said, it's like, you know, wasn't this spectacular though? Like these monsters were raging and kind of destroying whole buildings with a swish of their tail, and you know, rampaging through the buildings, and you know, they're just kind of like little Legos, like, you know, that they're able to kind of charge right through and stuff.
Yeah, and I think why there's this satisfaction to that kind of thing, or why we keep seeing disaster movies, and this is because, you know, cities represent very much the kind of structure that we can't freely navigate. You know, they represent boundaries basically of our society. So it's quite satisfying to see something that doesn't have to adhere by all the rules that we do and just like tear down buildings so they feel like it. So that's probably where the satisfaction comes from, watching these kind of things, I guess.
It's like the ultimate sociopath or psychopath, I guess. You know?
Yeah, it kind of represents our own sort of monstrous psychopath. Yeah.
So speaking of the kind of overcoming the social systems and all that kind of stuff, let's talk about Shin Godzilla.
Yeah, and I have to say, this was a real surprise for me. I wasn't expecting much of this movie, and I was very pleasantly surprised by how good it was, actually. I really enjoyed this one. And the style, I mean, stylistically very different from any of the US remakes or the monster remakes, in that it uses a lot of fast cutting, kind of found footage, people viewing things on their mobile phone. There's a real emphasis on realism, as ridiculous as that sounds in a Godzilla movie.
Right.
But you know, there's a lot of very sort of, I would say, pretty serious stuff that goes on in Shin Godzilla. Well, and I think it's actually won Film of the Year and Director of the Year. And if people don't know the guy that created this, I don't want to butcher his name, but I think it's Hideaki Anno, who is, well, I know him more for his animation work. Because he worked on a number of Miyazaki movies, most famously Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind, which is somewhat similar in that it has creatures that are sort of wild and rampaging and are ultimately misunderstood. So it's a bit more kind of like the 1999 Godzilla in that respect. But he also did Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is, I don't know. I think it's one of those top 10 animes that anyone who's even vaguely interested in anime should watch, because it's surreal and thought-provoking and artistically very interesting. So when I realized he was involved in it, I said, oh yeah, okay, this is going to be pretty good.
Yeah, you know, I think the thing that really surprised me about it was that I felt like in a lot of ways this was like pretty sophisticated for, you know, like kind of, you know, the monster movies. I mean, you know, like it's definitely far removed from, you know, like the stuff that you know, was in the 70s, whatever, like that you see as a typical monster movie. Even like, you know, as late we won't talk about it, but the 2000 version was pretty much more in line with you know, the Godzilla 2000, which was like kind of their millennium counterbalance, I guess, for the one we saw with you know, Matthew Broderick and stuff, and that one was still pretty much in the traditional, you know, monster movie, you know, in terms of cinematography, in terms of, you know, just effects and all that kind of stuff. But then you had this one, you know, like kind of that, and you know, this one came recommended as like one of the, you know, remakes to kind of or, you know, sequels, whatever, kind of to check out, stuff like that. and I can see why now. Like it there's so much political commentary. There's so much of it that's like satire or stuff like that. And then on top of it, it's like you said, the different cuts and the combination with the found footage and everything just really made it like just really in many different ways cutting above, and also just not what you would expect of a typical Godzilla movie and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for me, as we sort of talked about last week, the 1954 version is very much a kind of Godzilla is the expression of the trauma of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also of Japan's own role in it's in World War II and trying to come to grips with that. And I think this definitely sort of builds on this in that it takes for me it's a very sort of anti-authoritarian movie in that it shows this ineffectual older generation that's in charge that doesn't really know what to do with this cultural legacy of post-war Japan and this sort of trauma mixed with the kind of shame, if you will, of what kind of happened and how they actually come to grips with that. And the fact that, they're basically, as a country, they've been, they can't have an army. They can't really defend themselves. So there's this expression of which direction does the country go in? And I don't think there's any coincidence that when we first see Godzilla emerge and it comes and it's on the land, it is directionless. It has no kind of it doesn't seem like it's got any kind of conscious will. It's like this sort of thing that's just sort of going in any kind of direction, trying to survive, and acts like a wounded animal that's trying to kind of work out what it's supposed to do with itself. And I think that there must be some subconscious element of that of the culture of post-war Japan.
And when you initially see Godzilla, I thought like it was a joke at first, or I thought it was like another monster because it looked like a cartoonish kind of abstraction or something like that. And what you come to find out, again, as always, spoilers, that like he's kind of mutating into the form that we know as Godzilla. Like, in other words, he's not even formed as Godzilla. And I feel like in some ways, that's also a little bit of reference of how, like, we talked last week about how, the things that, people associate with Japan, Godzilla being one of the main things and stuff like that. I think, even though like Godzilla starts off in 54 being this kind of monster, this kind of thing, like you said, man versus nature, this kind of monstrosity, this thing to kind of fight off. But in some ways, I think there's this recognition that he's become like almost like this emblem or this kind of icon for Japan in some ways and stuff, their identity and where do they fit into the the global community and stuff.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how much of that is, and that's why it keeps coming back all the time. But that visual effect of, I mean, what makes it look so weird is these very wide eyes that are completely sort of blank and sort of vacant looking and staring, kind of like a dead fish almost is what they look like in a way. But this kind of represents, I think, it's like an unthinking existence. And, it's like an expression of something that's sort of desperate, but alive, but sort of doesn't quite know what it's doing. There's this weird sort of desperation of an animal that's kind of fighting for survival. And I mean, one thing that I think is a theme that you see in this and some another sort of anime like Nausicaa and Princess Mononoke is this idea of a wounded animal is actually one of the most dangerous kind of animals because it's something that doesn't have any kind of control over what it's doing. And that's very much what you get with this initial form of Godzilla as it comes through.
Yeah, and then meanwhile, you have like these kind of people in these committees and stuff like that debating, like, what should we do? Kind of, let's form an emergency summit. Kind of like, like to have a response to the tail. Kind of, and just, but wait a minute, which department does this fall under? And like you said, it's kind of this out of date, out of touch, bureaucracy trying to respond to something. And I think, from what I understand, it's like it's a little bit of reflection of like the problems that they have with Fukushima, where like, they just had like these committees and this kind of infrastructure that just was so unable to kind of respond.
Yeah, or silencing, sort of voices that aren't usual. Like, Yaguchi, who's the first one who says, yeah, I think it's a monster. Basically, he's sidelined, and everyone says, don't be ridiculous. And there's this danger of kind of group think of this bureaucracy that is more worried about how it's perceived rather than protecting the lives of the people in the city.
It's a little bit like it's a bit like the King's Clothes, right? Where all the people are like, oh, isn't it grand? Isn't it great? Stuff like that. And then the one kid goes, he's naked. Kind of like that.
Totally. Yeah, and I like the scene where they bring in the scientific experts who again noticed an older generation versus a younger generation. And the older ones are just worried about their reputation. Right. You can say that. And they're completely ineffectual. So unlike, our US ones where the scientists are the heroes, the scientists are just as bad. Really, the people who actually make any difference in this tend to be this younger generation of, as they describe themselves, this, and this was probably my favorite scene, actually one of the most telling scenes in the whole movie, is the defense force that they set up of losers, nerds, outsiders, and lone wolves who are, and I think that, and what's interesting is how they're describing themselves and the monster, I think, is a representation of a younger generation in Japan versus an older generation, and how they view themselves. They've got themselves, basically, I'm trying to remember the quotes here because it's basically, they're saying, oh, so what have we got so far? Well, we've got this kind of data that we can't quite make head or tail of it. So what are we here for? And oh, we've got to fill in the blanks. So basically they're trying to sort of, the younger generation trying to fill in the blanks of what we do with all this kind of cultural baggage of what happened post-war. And they said, okay, so you can all just kind of sit around and speak freely. And then they sort of, talk about how this thing just has to sort of mutate its way out of this problem that it's having, that they've taken body fluid samples, but they had to burn the rest because under the US they said they couldn't abide by the stench of these bodily fluids that were coming out of Godzilla. So it's kind of this thing of they feel like the US would rather kind of like bury its whole history of the nuclear attacks. And then of course, what is the energy source of this subconscious trauma expressed as Godzilla? And they're like, nuclear fission, that's what's driving this. And again, it's kind of like the authority figure turns to them and says, right then, we're going to leave the analysis of this to you guys. So it's kind of like the younger generation with like us as an older generation, we can't really come to grips with this. So we're going to leave this to you to try and figure out what to do with this. So that's how I basically just interpreted that entire scene in that way.
Yeah, I thought it was also like kind of telling that, like when they had the new prime minister kind of, installed, stuff like that, his one key, like, the people are just kind of left and everything, like, and his only comment is that like his noodles got soggy, right? Like that's like his biggest problem and stuff like that. And he says, I knew this job would be difficult. It's like his one concern, kind of like that. Like he just wanted those people to kind of leave so he can eat in peace and stuff like that.
Yeah, the 9-to-5er who's lost sight of the actual goal at hand. Yeah. And I thought again it was also quite interesting the US envoy, who's this beautiful kind of second generation US citizen who's come back and is now telling them all what to do, and how they basically decide that they say it's not some sort of bilateral agreements, but basically it's kind of like yeah, we kind of want to take control of everything from the US, but it's a win-win for us, right, guys?
Right.
You know, that sort of seems to be a representation of, I guess, Japan's independence, you know, and how the US plays off it.
Yeah, and there's so much cynicism about like kind of, you know, like with the US kind of thing where you know, the whole one of the major conflicts, again, major spoilers always, that like is the fact that like the US is so ready to nuke Japan again. You know, kind of, and so like they're and you know, they're doing anything, you know, as possible to avoid that, of course. And meanwhile, like kind of, you know, it's almost like we're having, you know, this Kayoco, she, because she's, you know, Japanese, you know, partially and stuff like that. You know, not only is she able to speak the language and everything, but she's also like speaking for the Japanese, right? Like kind of she's like she's their kind of the Japanese people's into the U.S. and like their hope to like kind of have more control over what's happening to them, you know, from this country that on one hand, you know, bombed them, you know, like after, you know, at the end of World War II, but then also like rebuilt it. But meanwhile, like, you know, this is kind of on again, off again relationship, right, with the US and stuff. And so she's the hope that like, you know, because like it leaves off where, you know, like she's kind of like, I don't know about bragging, but she's kind of like talking about being the, you know, future US president, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of it's repeated more than once that you know, the bureaucrats are sort of ceding their power to the US in this face of a disaster, and it's all, and then again, it's kind of, even at the end, we're only allowed to kind of like have Godzilla frozen. You know, if he comes back, then, well, yeah, all the other countries have said, you know, we just got to nuke Tokyo, basically. That's the only solution, or nuke him. So, yeah, that was kind of interesting.
And it's interesting how, like, there's these little Godzillas almost kind of coming out of the tail and everything. So it's like almost like kind of, I guess in some ways, you know, like besides the kind of the horror kind of ending, so to speak, I think it's also like kind of representative of like, I don't know, that like, what does really Godzilla represent then, right? It's like kind of, and to some degree, it's the Japanese identity, but also like, I guess, you know, the little Godzilla, right? Or maybe like kind of the idea of like maybe, you know, the character of Japan kind of, you know, spreading, I guess, in some ways. And
yeah, well, that's interesting because, you know, there's another bit where they're talking about the US wanting to find information. But this is in the second, because each of these scenes where they have like this military drum roll and it's all of the loners all being interviewed about, you know, what they should do next with it. You know, in that one, they say, you know, again, this is an ancient creature surrounded by nuclear waste, and it's having to adapt to it. So for me, that's like Japanese culture. It's got to deal with this, you know, the modernism and various other things. You know, and then they ask, so what does the US want from Japan? Oh, they want to harvest the new elements from its body. So for me, that's that, like you said, these little mini Godzillas, I think Japanese people see that there is something inherently valuable about their culture because there are bits and pieces that are being adapted and taken up on all sorts of other things. So, yeah. And they also say that, you know, self-mutation, regardless of generation, is happening. And this trumps intelligence, which I thought was interesting. So it's almost like a lot of this kind of younger generation in this, who are the lone wolves and everyone else, you know, the nerds, that perhaps they're viewed as they have to kind of be very flexible and adapt to a kind of a shifting idea of how the international community views Japan, or how Japan itself views, or how intergenerational, you know, relationships view each other in Japan, and they have to kind of somehow navigate this, and that will be their way to success, perhaps. So
I mean, that's a great point because, you know, like let's look at kind of the more you know, kind of step back and the historical kind of thing, right? Because Japan was kind of known as we mentioned last time, as the land of knockoffs and stuff. And then over time, in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, then they started becoming this mark of quality, but through imitation though, like kind of, you know, like, so in some ways, like kind of like the Godzilla thing where it was formless and kind of, you know, like trying to find its identity, but over time started having its own character. And then, you know, like in the 80s, they started being recognized as kind of like this threat to to the American economy, right, and stuff. And, you know, like kind of Japanese autos were threatening to the US and everything. But then, you know, in some ways, you know, that's kind of been frozen, right, and stuff. You know, because like there was a stagnation that kind of happened with their economy after that. And now, like you said, you know, it's things like, you know, animes, things like, you know, manga that like kind of it's through its culture, it's spreading like little Japanese, you know, Godzillas, right, and stuff to influence the world.
Totally. And of course, video games, you know.
Video games, Sony, right, absolutely.
Yes. You know, so yeah, there's a huge connection there. But I think you're right. There's a huge commentary on the economy of Japan, because it has stagnated for God knows best part of 20 years. There's been quantitative easing after quantitative easing, and it's only really now actually that it actually looks like this year it's actually starting to kind of come out of this, and they're actually starting to get proper economic growth. But that could also be as well because of, you know, a younger generation coming in and displacing perhaps an older generation. So this is an oddly kind of timely movie in that respect. I mean, I think as well as, you know, there's one other line that was really telling in that when Yaguchi, they're talking about another bomb, and he's talking about post-war Japan, and he says, oh, post-war seems to last a long time. It's like, you know, the view of Japan is obviously, you know, very embedded in international sort of minds as well. And it does make you kind of think there's this weird kind of conflict, I think, for the Japanese that, you know, for them, they viewed the attacks on Nagasaki and Hiroshima probably as an incredible tragedy, as it should really. I mean, it was unprecedented for the time.
Was there 9/11?
Yeah, basically. And but the thing is, they're not allowed internationally to view it as a tragedy because it was seen as a response to their retaliation to their aggression for various things that they did in China and the rest of the world.
Right.
So in a way, you know, you kind of, I thought about this a little more, and often with events, you can either kind of look at it in a tragic way or a comic way. And the Japanese aren't really, as I said, they're not really allowed to look at it in a tragic way. So they have to look at it in either sort of a distorted or comedic way. And I think Godzilla is kind of like this distorted, almost comedic way. And there's a lot of anime that plays with kind of apocalyptic visions, but in a kind of slightly humorous way. You know? And I think that just must be the way that it's kind of just filtered through.
Yeah, that's a great point. That, like, you know, it's got to come out some way, stuff like that. And, you know, if you're not able to kind of express it, like you said, as a, you know, tragic thing, stuff, it's almost like in a way, like the comedians, right, who they, you know, there's the ones that, you know, some of the best ones work through a lot of the pain through the humor and stuff. And, you know, I think that's kind of partially where Godzilla kind of became this campy kind of character in some ways. But, you know, I think here we have a movie that, like, you know, is doing it, but on the one hand, it is poking fun at the bureaucrats and the, you know, the system, all kind of stuff. But there's a sense of hope, though. There's also, like, kind of, you know, that, you know, like we talked about, the kind of the younger generation, the little Godzilla, so to speak, spreading out to the world. But also, like, you know, that, like, there's this sense that, like, hey, you know, these older, you know, bureaucrats are only going to be long for so long. So we're, you know, we're going to have a hard time to kind of, you know, do things better and stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not completely critical of Japanese culture, though.
No.
I mean, there's lots of things like, there's a nice moment when they're all having tea together because they say, oh, we need a break, you know, and they have this, you know, this lady coming around, bringing some nice tea, and they all have a sort of a moment of just eating together and drinking tea, which is obviously like, you know, a very Japanese kind of thing. And there's even the line, there's hope for this country yet. So it's kind of, you know, there's that bit there. I mean, I think in terms of what you were sort of saying, in terms of the, it's interesting that Godzilla, they describe him as, his exoskeleton needs to cool off because it's generating so much heat, and you kind of feel like this is like the sort of the pent up sort of anger and various sort of trauma from these events is kind of expressed as this energy that's radiating off Godzilla. And that's what they need to kind of deal with. But likewise, I thought it was a really interesting finale that their solution is to cool it off and to basically freeze it, because it's almost like there is, as mentioned, there's this kind of paralysis, I think, in the culture, in that they can never really try and become an empire again, otherwise people are the international community will kind of jump on them. So there is this kind of feeling of maybe we just have to sort of stay in a kind of paralyzed state as a culture in order to be acceptable, because that was kind of how they finished that off. But
or they're gonna get bombed again. Kind of. I mean, that's in some ways like kind of really what it comes down to, right? In some ways that and there's definitely some truth to that. So, and I think what's interesting is what we don't see is there's no mention of China. I mean, because really like I think for different times that's partially the threat to the whole that part of the world, right, and stuff. And I'm wondering if that's somewhere sometime there's going to be something to do with that, there's gonna be a Chinese monster of some kind that we haven't seen it yet, but I think it's coming.
Yeah, right. Who knows? I mean, another interesting thing for me was that, I don't know if you noticed, but there was only one female bureaucrat. And you can kind of almost sort of, you can maybe make the stretch that she's like the sort of matriarchal kind of figure a little bit in that bureaucracy. And if you notice, she was the one that was the most vocal about destroying it. She's also the one that says, oh, thank God the US are going to come in and help destroy this. And she's quite happy to sacrifice. She's the first one that says, there's people we can sacrifice them in order to, destroy this thing. And so if this is kind of a representation perhaps of this post-war culture, then it's almost like you wonder if this is also a comment on perhaps Japanese women rejecting some parts of the more traditional culture and wanting to be more like,
I see,
a liberal sort of US society or something like that. Because you've also got the US envoy who's female as well.
I could tell you,
it was just very noticeable that she was the one.
Yeah, having had some friends, from Japan, stuff like that, women in particular, I could definitely see that would be, partially the that on the one hand they do find there's a charm to kind of the role of Japanese women in modern society, whatever. But the other, it's definitely, I mean, we think that there's constraints and and we've talked about that in different ways with women in the either the global world or particularly mostly the American, because mostly we're talking about American movies and stuff. But for the Japanese, it's still very constricting. Absolutely.
Yeah. I also thought it was interesting that the US envoy she wants to sort of leave because she doesn't want to see a third attack. Because she initially is introduced as someone who's completely outside of the culture, but then towards the end she's I mean, I'm not an immigrant by any number of generations or anything, but there is this kind of I'm always sort of intrigued by this kind of idea of identity between generations and things like this. They kind of.
I mean, as somebody from Great Britain, I mean, if they bombed, the UK, I think you would still find it pretty distressing, to say the least.
Yeah, not even that. Brexit was fairly distressing to watch unfold.
Right. Yeah. And that was done by the country itself too. So
I know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one thing I wanted to sort of mention about this the scene where the US bombers actually bomb Godzilla, because it's the first time anything has actually had an effect on Godzilla. And of course, that's what prompts him to burn the city.
Oh, right.
So there's this kind of message that, an aggression towards the culture will end up kind of destroying itself as well. Like any kind of an aggressive kind of Japanese culture could destroy itself just as much as other people could want to destroy it as well. That's kind of what I got from that. But, yeah, definitely an interesting take on it.
And like you said,
unlike anything I'd seen before.
I think it has a lot to do with the director who, I'm actually not familiar with his anime work, but I definitely, am more interested in looking at it. That, I can definitely see it being thought-provoking because I guess, what's surprising to me about that is the fact that, like, I wouldn't have guessed that that's his background because, here he's working with live actors and, granted, voice actors, there is some degree of acting that you have to kind of, handle the acting and everything, but it's still very different, right? I would think to work with live actors and where you have to like kind of really think about blocking shots and different times think about how you're going to frame their reactions and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting about anime is that you can literally, well, I mean, I guess it came out from limited budgets to make something entertaining, but also creating something that's very, very fantastic because you can draw anything you want.
Right.
And there is an awful lot of anime that is about the end of the world and or huge things attacking various other things, and
right.
And it's funny because I mean this I think if you watch Shin Godzilla, you understand a lot. It actually makes Neon Genesis Evangelion make a lot more sense because you can kind of see that the angels, which are these kind of aliens that attack Earth, are perhaps just kind of other more abstracted versions of Godzilla, really.
Huh.
And they also mutate and do various interesting. I mean, that's kind of like the episodic nature of Neon Genesis Evangelion is that something weird turns up, starts destroying things, and then you try attacking it in the way you did before and it doesn't work, and you have to kind of figure out there has to be some other way of kind of defeating this monster in some new sort of way. But yeah, it's a wild ride, Evangelion, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone. It may not actually seem like it makes a lot of sense, and perhaps it doesn't. It's a fun ride nonetheless. And of course, any movie by Miyazaki is worth watching.
Definitely. Yeah, so we'll definitely continue looking at the Godzilla, what's called this time with the Kong versus Godzilla, which kind of gets a little bit more into the WWF aspect of these monsters and stuff.
Yeah, well, and we've also got Godzilla King of Monsters and Destroy All Monsters coming up right as well.
Good point.
Which, I mean, not being enough of a Godzilla expert, we kind of picked Destroy All Monsters because it seemed like a kind of a logical comparison to the 2019 one, which has various others and enemy monsters for Godzilla to fight off. But yeah.
So yeah, definitely looking forward to more kaiju smackdowns and continuing to look at Godzilla. So I'm once again John Tang with Dan Edmonds, and we'll see you next time.